The conference hall stretched 300 meters across its widest point, and the ceiling rose so high that clouds sometimes formed near the top during particularly heated debates among the Galactic Council members who gathered there to decide the fate of trillions of beings across known space. Sarah Chun sat in the human delegation's assigned seats and felt the familiar weight of insignificance pressing down on her shoulders like a physical thing that never quite went away, no matter how many years she spent in these chambers representing Earth and its colonies. The Volthani representative was speaking now, and his voice carried that particular tone of ancient wisdom that his species had perfected over their 15,000 years of recorded civilization. The humans must understand that their request for expanded settlement rights in the Outer Barrens shows exactly the kind of impulsive thinking we have worked so hard to help them overcome. The Volthani said, and his translator rendered his clicking speech into perfectly condescending. Standard Galactic Sarah kept her face neutral, even though she wanted to stand up and scream that the Outer Barrens were unclaimed systems that nobody wanted until humanity had shown they could be terraformed and made livable for carbon-based species. That was how it always went, though. Humans would find something worthwhile in places the elder species had dismissed as useless, and suddenly there would be regulations and committees and lengthy approval processes that took decades to resolve. The Zethir Collective spokesperson added their input next, and the insectoid beings' multifaceted eyes glittered in the chamber's artificial light. As they spoke, we propose a 15-year study period to assess the environmental impact of human colonization before any settlements are approved, the Zethir said, and Sarah heard several other delegates chittering their approval. 15 years an entire generation of humans would age, while bureaucrats debated whether they deserved to build homes on worlds that nobody else wanted. Sarah had been doing this job for 12 years now, and she remembered when she first arrived, full of hope that humanity could prove itself worthy of respect among the stars. Earth had been so eager to join the galactic community back then, and humanity had agreed to every restriction and limitation the Council demanded. Military had been reduced to nothing more than ceremonial peacekeepers with weapons that could barely stop a riot, much less defend against a serious threat. Human ships were limited in size and capability, and even merchant vessels had to follow strict guidelines about their engine output and defensive capabilities. Territorial expansion had been frozen at the original colony worlds, and every new settlement required council approval that almost never came. The elder species said it was all for humanity's own good, because humans were young and impulsive and had a history of violence that needed to be carefully managed. 3 generations of humans had now grown up under these restrictions, and most of them accepted the situation as normal. Sarah herself had believed the rhetoric once upon a time when she was young and idealistic, and thought that following the rules would eventually earn humanity a place at the table as equals. She knew better now, but she still did her job because someone had to, and walking away would only make things worse. The debate continued for another 3 hours, and Sarah made her carefully worded arguments and submitted her formal requests and followed every single protocol exactly as required. In the end, the council voted to table the settlement expansion request for further study, and Sarah nodded politely and thanked them for their consideration like she was supposed to. After the session ended, she walked through the grand corridors of the council station and past delegates from dozens of species who barely acknowledged her presence. A group of Krull sovereignty warriors stood near one of the observation windows, and their scaled bodies bristled with barely concealed aggression as they watched her pass. The Krull were one of the council's more troublesome members, and they had a reputation for pushing boundaries and testing limits whenever they thought they could get away with it. They had been making noise lately about disputed territories near human space, but the council assured everyone that diplomatic channels would resolve the issues peacefully. Sarah had learned not to trust those assurances, but What could she do when Earth had agreed to let the Council mediate all disputes involving member species? She made her way back to the human delegation's modest quarters and found her assistant, Marcus, waiting with the daily reports from the colonies. "Anything urgent?" Sarah asked as she collapsed into her chair and felt the exhaustion of another wasted day settling into her bones. The usual complaints about trade restrictions and mineral extraction quotas, Marcus said, and then he hesitated before continuing. There's also increased Krell activity near Tarnus V, but the Council's monitoring station says it's just routine patrols. Tarnus V was one of humanity's most successful agricultural colonies, and 800,000 people called it home. The planet produced enough food to feed several other human worlds, and it's fertile. Valleys had transformed from empty wilderness into thriving farmland in just 2 generations. Sarah made a note to file an inquiry about the Krell activity, but she knew it would be added to a queue of thousands of similar inquiries that might get answered in a few months if she was lucky. She spent the evening reviewing files and preparing arguments for tomorrow's session, where she would once again try to convince beings who had ruled the stars for millennia that humans deserved basic rights. Her apartment overlooked one of the station's garden sections, and she could see species from across the galaxy walking among carefully maintained plants from their home world. Shamans had submitted requests to add Earth plants to the gardens 7 years ago, and the requests were still pending approval from the Botanical Review Committee that was life in the Galactic Council, where everything moved at the pace of the slowest species, and the newest members had to wait their turn for everything. Sarah poured herself a drink and stood at the window watching the stars. Beyond the station's hulls, somewhere out there, human colonies struggled under restrictions that made every day harder than it needed to be. Somewhere out there, humans worked twice as hard as other species to achieve half as much because the Council had decided that was fair. Somewhere out there, families raised children who would never know what it meant to live without someone else's permission, governing every aspect of their lives. Sarah raised her glass to those distant lights and made the same silent promise she made every night. She would keep fighting and keep arguing and keep pushing, because eventually the Council would have to recognize that humanity had earned respect through 3 generations of perfect compliance. She still believed that even after 12 years of disappointment, she had to believe it, because the alternative was accepting that humanity had traded its freedom for nothing more than the privilege of being the galaxy's favorite example of a species that knew its place. The next morning would bring another session and another round of debates, another day of being treated like children who needed constant supervision. But Sarah would be there making humanity's case with the same professional courtesy and careful diplomacy that the Council demanded. That was what civilized species did. After all, they followed the rules and trusted the system and believed that patience and good behavior would eventually be rewarded. 3 generations of humans had believed that story. Sarah was beginning to wonder if they had all been fools. The message arrived during breakfast, and Sarah watched her coffee cup shake in her hand as she read the words on her datapad 3 times before they started to make sense. The Krell sovereignty had filed a territorial claim on the Tarnus system, citing ancient migration routes that supposedly gave them historical rights to the region. Sarah immediately called for an emergency session, but the Council's administrative office informed her that emergency sessions required a 3-day notice period unless at least 5 senior members agreed to waive the requirement. She spent those 3 days sending messages to every ally humanity had managed to cultivate over the years, but the responses were all variations of the same theme: wait for the proper channels and trust the process, and remember that hasty actions lead to regrettable outcomes. On Tarnus V, the colonial governor Jennifer Watts was dealing with a different kind of message. Krell warships had entered orbit around the planet and were demanding that all human settlements prepare for immediate evacuation. "They can't do this," Jennifer said during the emergency conference call with Earth and Sarah's office. We've been here for 40 years, and we followed every single rule about colonization permits. Sarah had already reviewed the files, and Jennifer was right about everything except the part that mattered. The Krell claim included a clause about disputed territories, and council law stated that populations in disputed territories had to relocate during mediation to prevent conflicts. How long do we have? Jennifer asked, and her voice carried the kind of cold fear that came from knowing the answer wouldn't be good. The council is reviewing the Krell submission. Sarah said carefully, I filed for an extension, but how long do we have? Jennifer repeated, 30 days. Sarah admitted, 30 days to evacuate 800,000 people. The silence on the call stretched for several seconds before Jennifer responded, we have maybe enough transport capacity for 100,000 if we pack people in like cargo. She said, we've been requesting more evacuation ships for years, but the council kept saying our infrastructure development plans were too aggressive. Sarah closed her eyes and felt something cold settling in her chest. She had approved those infrastructure reports herself, and she had believed the council when they said Tarnis Vi needed to grow more slowly to avoid disturbing the local ecosystem. Now 800,000 people were about to pay the price for that compliance. The council finally convened. 4 days later, and Sarah made her arguments with all the passion and logic she could muster. Velthani listened politely and then explained that the law was clear about disputed territories. The Zephyr Collective added that humanity should have been more careful about settling worlds that might have historical significance to other species. Sarah wanted to point out that the Krell had never mentioned any historical significance until human terraforming had turned Tarnis V from a barren rock into a productive world, but she knew better than to make accusations without absolute proof. The council voted to uphold the evacuation order, but granted humanity an additional 15 days to complete the process, 45 days total to move 800,000 people. Sarah sent the decision to Jennifer and tried not to think about what would happen to the people who couldn't get off the planet in time. On Tarnis Vi, the evacuation began immediately, but the reality of the situation became clear within the first week. Transport ships that humanity was allowed to operate under council regulations simply couldn't move enough people quickly enough. Jennifer organized a lottery system for the available spaces and tried to prioritize families with children, but there was no good way to choose who lived and who stayed behind. The Krell watched from orbit and sent periodic reminders about the deadline. Sarah spent every waking hour trying to find additional transport capacity, but every request ran into the same bureaucratic walls. Human ships weren't certified for the passenger loads they would need to carry, and emergency certifications required safety inspections that took weeks, and nobody seemed to think this qualified as enough of an emergency to skip the inspections. 20 days into the evacuation, the Krell commander sent a new message. The deadline was being moved up to 25 days total, because Krell settlers needed to begin their own operations and couldn't wait for humans to finish their unnecessarily slow departure. Sarah appealed the decision, but the council ruled that the Krell had the right to adjust timelines for their own territory. The evacuation became chaos as people realized that hundreds of thousands of them would not get off Tarnis Vi in time. Jennifer kept order as best she could, but riots broke out in 3 major cities as people fought for spaces on the last ship. Sarah watched the reports coming in and felt helpless in a way she had never experienced before. She had spent 12 years believing that the system worked and that following the rules would protect humanity. Now she was watching 800,000 people abandoned by that same system. The 25th day arrived, and the last human transport ship lifted off from Tarnis Vi with every available space filled beyond capacity. 760,000 people remained on the surface. Jennifer Watts was among them because she had given her space to a pregnant mother who needed medical care. The Crow fleet descended the next morning. What happened next would be debated in council chambers for years, but the facts were simple and terrible. The Krell didn't occupy Tarnisvi, they cleansed it orbital. The bombers hit the major cities first and turned the carefully built homes and schools and hospitals into burning craters ground. Forces landed after the initial strikes and hunted down survivors with systematic efficiency. The surveillance satellites that humanity was allowed to maintain in the system captured everything, families running through streets as Krell soldiers fired into crowds, children hiding in basements that became their tombs when the buildings above collapsed. Jennifer Watts broadcasting a final message before the transmission cut off mid-sentence. Sarah watched the footage in her office with Marcus standing silent beside her. She watched for 3 hours until there was nothing left to see except smoke rising from the ruins of what had been humanity's proudest agricultural achievement. Death toll took 2 weeks to calculate with any accuracy. 760,000 confirmed dead, with another 40,000 missing and presumed killed. The Galactic Council called an emergency session, and the Volthani representative spoke with great sadness about the tragedy. The Zephyr Collective proposed sanctions against the Krell sovereignty that would restrict their trade access for 6 months. Sarah sat through the entire session without saying a word when they finally asked for the human delegation's input. She stood slowly and walked to the speaking platform. "What are you going to do?" she asked. The question seemed to confuse the council members. "We have outlined the sanctions," the Volthani said gently. "The Krell will face consequences for their excessive actions." 760,000 human beings were murdered, Sarah said, and her voice sounded strange even to her own ears. "What are you going to do?" "We must be careful not to escalate," the Zephyr Collective responded. "Further violence serves no purpose." Sarah looked around the chamber at beings from dozens of species who had lived in peace for thousands of years. She saw their confusion and their discomfort and their absolute certainty that the proper response to mass murder was a strongly worded resolution and temporary trade restrictions. "You're not going to do anything," she said quietly. "You're going to file reports and have debates, and maybe in a few years, you'll lift the sanctions early as a gesture of reconciliation." Nobody contradicted her. Sarah walked out of the council chamber and didn't look back. She returned to Earth the next day and submitted her resignation. Effective immediately, her final act as humanity's representative was to release all the footage from Tarnis 6 directly to public networks across human space without council approval. The rules said such footage had to be reviewed for disturbing content before public distribution. Sarah didn't care about the rules anymore. She had seen where following the rules led. The footage from Tarnisvi has spread through human space like a virus that nobody could contain or control. Every network tried to add warnings about the disturbing content, but people watched anyway because they needed to see what happened when humanity trusted the galaxy to protect its children. Sarah stood on the stage at the United Earth Assembly, and the crowd, representatives from every human nation and colony, filled the massive hall to capacity. She had been asked to speak about her experience in the council and what she thought humanity should do next. "I spent 12 years telling you to be patient," Sarah began, and her voice echoed through the chamber. "I told you that if we followed the rules and proved ourselves worthy, then the galaxy would accept us as equals." She pulled up an image on the screen behind her, and the crowd went silent. It showed a school on Tarnis the 6th, before the attack, with children playing in a courtyard, surrounded by gardens that their families had planted. "This is what patience got us," she said, and switched to the next image. The same school was now a crater, and nothing remained except scorched earth and twisted metal. "I watched the council debate for 3 hours about whether 6 months of trade sanctions was too harsh a punishment for this," Sarah continued. "I listened to beings who have lived for centuries explain that we needed to think about the big picture and not let emotion cloud our judgment. She could see people in the audience crying and others sitting with expressions of cold rage. They told me that escalation serves no purpose. Sarah said, they told me that proper channels would deliver justice in time. The next image showed Krell soldiers standing over bodies in a street. I believed them once. Sarah said softly, I believed that civilization meant something and that the rules existed to protect everyone equally. She turned off the display and looked out at the assembled representatives. I was wrong, and my mistake cost 760,000 lives. Sarah walked away from the podium and took her seat and waited for the response. The debate that followed lasted 3 days and spread across every human world through live broadcasts that drew the largest audiences in history. Political leaders who argued for continued council membership found themselves shouted down by crowds who had seen the footage. Diplomats who suggested working within the system to reform it were voted out of their positions by overwhelming margins. The Pacific Alliance voted first, and their decision was unanimous. They would withdraw from the Galactic Council effective immediately. The Euro-African Union followed 6 hours later with the same result. The American Confederation took another day to debate, but the outcome was never in doubt. One by one, every major human government made the same choice. Humanity was leaving the Council and reclaiming its right to self-determination. Joint declaration was written by a committee that included Sarah and was presented to both Earth's population and the Galactic Council simultaneously. The document was short and clear. Humanity appreciated the Council's attempt to guide them, but recent events had proven that the relationship was not working. Earth was withdrawing from all Council treaties and would no longer recognize Council authority over human affairs. All restrictions on human military capability were now void. All limitations on territorial expansion were rejected. Humanity would defend its people by whatever means necessary. The final paragraph sent shockwaves through the galaxy. We came to you seeking civilization. The declaration read, you taught us that civilization is a luxury purchased with the blood of those who cannot defend themselves. We tried to be what you wanted. Now we will be what we are. The Council's response came within hours and demanded that humanity reconsider its reckless decision. The Velthani warned that isolation from the galactic community would lead to stagnation and decline. Zephyr Collective threatened economic sanctions that would cripple human trade. Sarah watched the threats pile up and felt nothing except a cold clarity about what needed to happen next. The economic sanctions started immediately, but humanity had been preparing for this possibility since the declaration. Trade with Council species dropped to zero within a week, but human colonies had been forced to develop self-sufficiency by the same regulations that were supposed to help them. The threatened economic collapse never materialized because humans had learned to survive without depending on alien charity. The military buildup began the same day the declaration was announced. Shipyards across human space that had been building cargo haulers and mining vessels were retooled for warship production. Engineers who had spent careers working around Council restrictions on engine output and weapon systems suddenly had no restrictions at all. The results were spectacular. Human creativity had always been one of the species' defining traits, but the Council had channeled that creativity into approved areas like agriculture and art. Now that creativity was focused on a single question: how do you kill things that think you're too primitive to be dangerous? The first new human warship was completed in 6 weeks, and it incorporated technology that would have gotten the designers arrested under Council law. The second wave of ships took only 4 weeks because the production systems were refined by the third month. Humanity was launching new warships faster than the Council. Intelligence services could track them. The designs were radical compared to galactic standard vessels. Human ships were smaller and faster and designed for combat doctrines that the Council species had forgotten during their thousands of years of ritualized warfare stealth systems that Council ships didn't bother to counter because nobody used. Stealth in civilized combat missile systems with autonomous targeting that violated 3 different Council treaties about automated weapons electronic warfare capabilities that could blind and confuse enemy sensors in ways that the elder species considered unsporting. Admiral James Okafor was given command of the new human defense fleet, and his first order was to establish a perimeter around all human colonies. The second order was to train every ship captain in tactics that hadn't been used since Earth's pre-contact war's deception, and ambush and hit-and-run attacks that struck hard and disappeared before the enemy could respond. The Krell sovereignty watched these developments with growing concern there. Intelligence reported that humans were building a military force, but the Krell leadership dismissed the threat. Humans had been pacified for 3 generations, and the Council had assured everyone that humanity lacked the cultural knowledge to wage effective war. The Krell decided to test that assumption. 4 months after the Tarnus, the 6th Massacre, a Krell raiding fleet hit a small human mining colony called New Perth. The colony had a population of 50,000 and minimal defenses. The Krell expected a repeat of Tarnus VI. They expected panic and surrender, and the Council intervening to negotiate another favorable settlement. What they got instead was a human battle group that appeared out of nowhere and cut off their retreat. The Battle of New Perth lasted 6 hours. When it was over, every Krell ship was debris, and the human fleet had suffered moderate damage to 3 vessels with no total losses. Admiral Okafor sent a message to Krell space that was intercepted and broadcast across the entire galaxy. "You came to our worlds expecting victims." The message said, "You found warriors instead. This is your only warning. Leave human space or we will come to yours." The Krell sovereignty responded with outrage and demanded that the Council intervene against human aggression. The Council called for an emergency session and asked humanity to explain its unprovoked attack. Admiral Okafor attended the session in his military uniform instead of diplomatic robes. Unprovoked? He asked the assembled delegates. The Krell murdered 760,000 civilians 4 months ago. Now they attack another human colony, and you call our defense unprovoked. The Volthani tried to explain that the proper response was to work through diplomatic channels, so Okafor cut him off with a gesture. That would have been considered rude in any other context. "You had your chance to be our protectors," he said. "You chose committee meetings and strongly worded letters. We will not make that mistake again." The Krell launched a full military campaign the next week. They sent their best fleets and their most experienced commanders. They had thousands of years of military tradition and overwhelming numerical superiority. They lost anyway. Human forces hit them from every direction, using tactics that no Council species had employed in living memory. Krell supply lines were destroyed by small human ships that appeared without warning. Krell command stations were attacked by forces that used the terrain and sensor shadows to approach. Undetected Krell fleets found themselves fighting enemies who refused to engage in honorable fleet-to-fleet combat, and instead picked them apart with precision strikes. Within 6 months, the Krell sovereignty was suing for peace. Admiral Okafor's response was broadcast across every channel in the galaxy. Unconditional surrender. Now, the Krell homeworld had never been attacked in species. Recorded history and the sight of human warships in orbit above their capital city sent shockwaves through the entire sovereignty. Admiral Okafor stood on the bridge of the flagship Tarnus Memorial and watched the planet below with no satisfaction or joy in what he was about to do. This wasn't about revenge, even though every human alive wanted the Krell to suffer the way Tarnus V had suffered. This was about making sure it never happened again. Send the terms. Okafor ordered. The Krell government received a simple list of demands. All Military vessels were to be surrendered immediately. All weapons manufacturing facilities were to be destroyed under human supervision. All military installations within 10 light years of human space were to be dismantled. Any future Krell military force would be limited to system defense craft with no faster-than-light capability. Krell leadership would stand trial for war crimes related to Tarnis VI. The Krell High Command tried to negotiate, but Okafor cut off communication after their first attempt. These are not negotiations. He broadcast on all frequencies. You have 6 hours to accept, or we start dismantling your infrastructure from orbit. The Krell accepted with 5 minutes to spare. What followed was the most comprehensive disarmament in galactic history. Human forces moved through Krell space like a surgical team removing a cancer. Every shipyard that could build military vessels was reduced to scrap. Every weapons depot was emptied and the contents destroyed. Every military academy was closed and its records seized. Galactic Council watched in horror and sent delegation after delegation demanding that humanity stop its excessive actions. So Kafir met with them once and his message was brief. "Where were you when they were murdering our children?" He asked. "Where were your demands when Krell soldiers were hunting families through burning streets? You had your chance to deliver justice. Now watch what justice looks like when the victims stop asking for permission." The operation took 3 months, and when it was complete, the Krell sovereignty still existed as a political entity, but its ability to threaten anyone was gone. Okafor left a small monitoring force in Krell space with orders to respond to any attempt at rearmament with immediate and overwhelming force. Then he took the fleet home. The trial of the Krell commanders was held on Earth and broadcast live across human space. Evidence presented included surveillance footage and testimony from the few survivors who had escaped Tarnis VI. The Krell defendants argued that they were following orders from their government, and that the attack was conducted according to their understanding of the evacuation timeline. The human judges were not impressed. 15 Krell officers were found guilty of war crimes and crimes against sentient beings. The sentences ranged from life imprisonment to execution, depending on the specific actions each defendant had taken. The Galactic Council condemned the trials as victor's justice and demanded the prisoners be released. Humanity ignored the demands. The smaller species in the galaxy watched these events with a mixture of fear and hope. Fear, because humanity had demonstrated military capabilities that exceeded anything the Council had seen in millennia. Hope, because maybe someone was finally willing to stand up to the elder species who had dominated galactic politics for so long. Sarah Chun received visitors from a dozen different species in the months following the Krell surrender. They came quietly and asked careful questions about whether humanity might be interested in mutual defense agreements. The pattern was always the same. They were species that had been ignored or dismissed by the Council. They had grievances about trade restrictions or territorial disputes or 100 other ways the elder species had made their lives difficult. They wanted to know if humanity would help them the way humanity had helped itself. Sarah brought these requests to the United Earth Assembly, and debate was intense. Some argued that humanity should focus on its own recovery and avoid foreign entanglements. Others saw an opportunity to reshape galactic politics in a way that actually protected the vulnerable. The compromise was a new organization called the Mutual Defense Compact. Any species could join if they agreed to 3 simple principles. Members would defend each other against aggression. Members would respect each other's sovereignty. Members would not tolerate the murder of civilians. Under any circumstances, 17 species signed the charter in the first month. The Galactic Council declared the compact an illegal organization and threatened sanctions against any species that joined. 3 more species signed up the next week. Galaxy was fracturing into competing power blocks in a way it hadn't experienced in thousands of years. The Council represented the traditional order, where elder species made decisions for everyone else. The compact represented something new, where Species defended themselves and each other without asking permission. The unaligned systems tried to navigate between the two while avoiding conflict. Sarah was elected as the first director of the compact, and she approached the job with a very different philosophy than she had used as humanity's council representative. We're not here to be liked, she told the first assembly of compact members. We're here to make sure that what happened to Tarnis Vi never happens to any of us again. If that means the council thinks we're aggressive, then so be it. I'd rather be called aggressive than watch more children burn. The compact established its headquarters on Luna and began coordinating defense strategies across its member species. Human military advisors trained other species in tactics that the council had forgotten. Compact shipyards began producing vessels based on human designs, but adapted for different species' needs. The economic integration happened naturally as compact members started trading preferentially with each other. Council's threatened sanctions became meaningless when compact species simply stopped depending on Council. Trade Admiral Okafor was promoted to Supreme Commander of Compact Defense Forces, and his first initiative was to establish a rapid response fleet. Never again would any member species have to wait while bureaucrats debated whether their people deserved protection. The fleet could deploy to any member world within 72 hours. The first test of the new system came 8 months after the compact was formed. A council species called the Thran hegemony attempted to seize resource-rich asteroids in a system belonging to one of the smaller compact members. The compact response was immediate. Human ships arrived within 48 hours and took up positions around the disputed asteroids. When the Thran fleet arrived, they found themselves facing a force that outnumbered them 3-1. The Thran commander demanded that the humans leave what was clearly Thran territory based on ancient claims. Okafor's response was broadcast across the system. The compact doesn't recognize claims based on who said something first 1,000 years ago. He said, "These asteroids belong to the species currently mining them. You can leave peacefully, or we can make you leave. Choose quickly." The Thran chose to leave. Council condemned the incident as human intimidation and accused the compact of destabilizing the galactic order. Sarah addressed these accusations in a public statement that was replayed across compact space. "The council calls us destabilizing because we refuse to let strong species bully weak ones," she said. "They call us aggressive because we actually defend our members instead of forming study committees. They call us dangerous because we've proven that their way isn't the only way. Good. Let them be afraid. Fear keeps our people alive." Military incidents continued over the following year, but the pattern was always the same. Council species would test the compact's resolve. The compact would respond with overwhelming force. The council species would back down. No shots were fired in most of these confrontations because the council species realized they were facing opponents who actually would fight. The mere willingness to use force turned out to be more effective than force itself. The Volthani reached out to Sarah through unofficial channels and requested a private meeting. They met on a neutral station, and the ancient being looked tired in a way Sarah had never seen before. "You're destroying an order that has kept the peace for 10,000 years. The Volthani said. Sarah looked at the being who had once lectured her about patience and wisdom. "Your peace was built on species like mine, accepting that we didn't matter as much as you did." Sarah replied, "That's not peace. That's just successful bullying. We tried it your way, and our children died. Now we do it our way, and our children live. If that destroys your order, then maybe your order deserved to be destroyed." The Volthani had no response. The meeting ended, and Sarah returned to Earth. Knowing that there was no going back, humanity had chosen its path, and dozens of other species had chosen to walk it with them. Galaxy would never be the same, and Sarah was fine with that. Better to live in an unstable galaxy where the weak could defend themselves than a stable one where stability was maintained by letting the strong do whatever they wanted. 2 years had passed since Tarnus VI burned, and the galaxy had settled into an uneasy new normal, where power meant something different than it had for thousands of years. The Vadhatamahid galaxy had settled into an uneasy new normal, where power meant something different than it had for thousands of years. The Veridis Ujikith burned, and the galaxy had settled into an uneasy new normal, where power meant something different than it had for thousands of years. The Galactic Council still existed, and still made pronouncements about galactic law and proper civilization, but fewer species paid attention anymore. The Mutual Defense Compact had grown to 43 member species and controlled nearly a third of known space. The rest of the galaxy remained unaligned and tried to profit from. Both sides, while avoiding commitment to either Sarah, stood in front of the council chamber one last time because they had summoned her to answer for what they called crimes against galactic peace. She had considered ignoring the summons but decided that some things needed to be said in person. The chamber looked exactly the same as it had when she first arrived 15 years ago, full of hope and naiveties. The Volthani representative spoke first, and his voice carried the same disappointed tone he had used so many times before. Director Chun. He began. The Council has compiled evidence of 47 separate incidents where compact forces have used threats or actual violence to interfere with legitimate Council operations. Sarah waited for him to finish the list. It took 20 minutes. When he was done, the Zephyr Collective added their own accusations about economic warfare and trade discrimination. Sarah listened to it all without interrupting. Finally, they asked if she had anything to say in humanity's defense. No. Sarah said simply. The council members looked confused, as if they had expected her to make arguments or excuses. No defense? The Velthani asked. You're admitting to these crimes? They're not crimes, Sarah replied. They're policy. Everything on your list is something we did deliberately to protect our members. You call it interference when we stop your member species from seizing territory. We call it defense. You call it economic warfare when we trade with our allies instead of your cartels. We call it freedom of choice. You call it violence when we actually back up our words with force. We call it credibility. The chamber erupted in angry chittering and clicking, and the sounds of outrage in a dozen different languages. Sarah waited for them to quiet down. I came here today because I wanted you to understand something. She continued. We're not asking for your approval anymore. We're not trying to prove we deserve a seat at your table. We built our own table and invited everyone who was tired of begging for scraps from yours. The Volthani's translator caught the anger in his voice when he responded. You were given a chance to be part of something greater than yourselves. He said, instead you chose barbarism and violence. Sarah smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. You gave us a chance to be your pets. She corrected. We chose to be free instead. If you think freedom is barbarism, then maybe we speak different. Languages, after all. She turned to leave, but stopped at the chamber door. One more thing, Sarah said. The council is invited to send observers to Tarnus 6 next month. We're holding a memorial service for the dead, and we want you to see what your civilization protected. She walked out without waiting for a response. The memorial on Tarnus VO was held on the 2nd anniversary of the massacre, and people came from across human space to attend. That the planet had been left exactly as the Krull had left it, with the ruins preserved as a reminder of what happened when the weak trusted the strong to protect them. Sarah stood with Admiral Okafor and watched as families placed flowers on the mass graves. The survivors who had escaped before the attack were there, and their faces showed the permanent scars of watching their world die. From orbit, the Galactic Council sent observers as requested, and they stood at the edge of the crowd, looking uncomfortable. When the formal ceremony ended, Sarah approached them. Do you understand now? She asked. Understand what? The Volthani observer replied. Why we refuse to trust you. Sarah gestured at the ruins around them. You stood in your chamber and debated the appropriate response while the bodies were still burning. You told us that patience and proper channels would deliver justice. You sanctioned the Krell for 6 months and called it accountability. Now you wonder why we choose our own path. The observer had no answer. Monument they unveiled that day was a simple black stone that stretched 30 meters high. The names of all 760,000 dead were carved into its surface in letters small enough that you had to stand close to read them at. The base was the inscription that Admiral Okafor had written. We tried to be better. They taught us better was fatal. We will not make that mistake again. Sarah placed her hand on the cold stone and thought about the person she had been when she first came to the council. That woman had believed in systems and rules and the basic decency of civilized beings. She had thought that following the proper procedures would eventually lead to justice. She had been wrong about everything that mattered. The woman she was now understood that civilization was just a word people used to describe their preferred form of control. The council's civilization meant accepting that some species mattered more than others. The compact civilization meant being willing to fight for the principle that everyone mattered. Equally, Sarah knew which version she preferred over. The following months, the galaxy continued its slow reorganization into the new power structure. The Council tried to maintain its authority, but every incident where they failed to protect a member species sent more recruits to the compact. The Thrawn Hegemony applied for compact membership after a trade dispute with the Zethir Collective left them economically isolated. Even some of the elder species were quietly reaching out to ask about observer status. The Velthani remained opposed, but Sarah noticed that their opposition was more rhetorical than practical. They no longer tried to stop species from joining the compact. They just complained loudly about it while adjusting to the new reality. Admiral Okafor implemented the final phase of compact military organization by establishing permanent defense stations at key strategic points. Any aggressor would now face a coordinated response from multiple species within hours. The old way of strong species bullying weak ones was becoming mathematically impossible. Sarah watched these developments with satisfaction, but also with awareness that the work was never truly finished. Peace wasn't a destination you reached and then relaxed. Peace was something you maintained through constant vigilance and the willingness to defend it when challenged. Humanity had learned that lesson in the worst way possible. Now they were teaching it to the rest of the galaxy, whether the galaxy wanted to learn or not. 3 years after Tarnis V, a young human diplomat named Marcus Chun took over as director of the compact. Sarah had trained him personally, and she trusted him to continue the work. Her last official act was to establish the Tarnis Foundation, which funded education and support for species fleeing persecution. If the council wouldn't protect the vulnerable, then the compact would, and the Foundation made sure refugees had somewhere safe to go. Sarah retired to Earth, but she never really left the work behind. She spent her remaining years writing and speaking about the dangers of trusting systems that valued order over justice. Her memoirs became required reading in compact diplomatic training. Her speeches were played at military academies across 43 worlds. When she died at the age of 87, the compact held a moment of silence that was observed from Earth to the furthest colony on the edge of known space. They buried her on Tarnis V next to the memorial. The inscription on her grave was simple. She believed civilization could be kind. She learned it had to be strong. She taught us to be both. Admiral Okafor attended the funeral and stood at attention while they lowered her into the ground. He was an old man now, but he still commanded the compact defense forces, and he still maintained the principle that had guided every decision since Tarnis VI. Never again would any compact member have to choose between following the rules and protecting their people. That was Sarah's legacy, and it would outlive Them all the galaxy continued turning and new challenges arose. The Council and the Compact learned to coexist in an uneasy balance. Sometimes they cooperated on mutual interests. Sometimes they competed for influence over unaligned species. But nobody forgot the lesson that humanity had taught them. There were species in the galaxy who would fight for what they believed was right. There were species who would refuse to accept that might made right. There were species who remembered what it meant to be predators even after generations of pretending to be prey. Humanity had spent 3 generations being civilized by someone else's definition. They had filed their teeth down and cut their claws and bowed their heads. And when that civilization failed them, they remembered exactly what evolution had made them. They were the species that hunted mammoths with sharpened sticks. The species that crossed oceans in wooden boats. The species that split atoms and touched the stars. The Council had wanted them tame. Instead, they reminded the galaxy why apex predators were called apex, and the galaxy would never forget. On Earth, the children growing up in the years after Tarnus Vi learned a different history than their grandparents had. They learned that peace was valuable, but submission was not. They learned that civilization meant protecting the weak, not ignoring them. They learned that humanity had tried the galaxy's way, and it had cost 760,000 lives. They learned to honor the dead by making sure it never happened again.